Alright, let's dive into a story that's been making waves in rural South Wales, and honestly, it's one of those situations that just makes you pause and think about the ripple effects of policy changes. Here's the deal: a family is facing the possibility of one parent losing their job because a school bus scheme has been scrapped. Sounds straightforward, right? But personally, I think this is where things get really interesting. It's not just about a bus pass, it's about the delicate balance of work, family, and the systems we rely on. First off, let's break it down. The family in question, the Hills, lives in a rural part of the Vale of Glamorgan. Their mom, Dawn, works as a private pediatric nurse, and her husband, Michael, works in a different industry. Both have shift patterns that make it impossible for them to do the school run for their 14-year-old son. Here's where the now-defunct Purchase Pass scheme comes in. It allowed parents to buy a spare seat on council-run school buses for kids outside the catchment zone. For the Hills, this wasn't a luxury, it was a lifeline. What makes this really interesting is how quickly things can unravel when one piece of the puzzle is removed. Without the bus pass, the family is left with two terrible options: either Michael gives up his job to do the school run, or they pay for a private taxi, which Dawn says would be unaffordable. And here's the kicker: Dawn is the primary earner. So, if Michael has to quit, it's not just a loss of income, it's a potential financial free fall. They are talking about cutting back on basics, skipping holidays, and even the possibility of losing their home. If you take a step back and think about it, this is a stark reminder of how fragile financial stability can be for so many families. One thing that immediately stands out is the emotional toll this is taking. Dawn mentions losing sleep and the added stress, which, honestly, doesn't surprise me. When you're forced to choose between your job and your child's education, it's a no-win situation. And let's not forget the son, who's entering his GCSE years, a critical time in his education. Moving him to a different school now. Dawn calls it catastrophic, and I couldn't agree more. What many people don't realize is how much these seemingly small policy changes can disrupt a child's sense of stability and independence. Now, let's talk about the broader implications. The council says the scheme was scrapped due to changes in Department for Transport regulations, specifically, rules about selling seats in vehicles that don't meet accessibility requirements. Fair enough, but here's where I have to raise an eyebrow: why wasn't there a better alternative in place? The council did mention a potential exemption scheme, but that's still up in the air. From my perspective, this feels like a classic case of policy changes being made without fully considering the human impact. What this really suggests is that we need to rethink how we approach these kinds of decisions. Personally, I think there's a bigger conversation to be had about rural infrastructure and support for working families. If a bus pass is the difference between keeping a job and losing it, maybe we need to ask why public transport isn't more accessible in the first place. And let's not forget the environmental angle: more cars on the road because of scrapped bus schemes. That's a step backward, not forward. A detail I find fascinating is the son's reaction. He's upset about losing the bus pass because it gave him independence and time with friends. That's huge. We often talk about education in terms of grades and exams, but what about the social and emotional aspects? This kid is losing a piece of his daily routine that mattered to him, and that's something we shouldn't brush aside. If you ask me, this story is a microcosm of larger issues: the strain on working families, the gaps in public services, and the unintended consequences of policy changes. It's easy to look at this as an isolated incident, but I think it's a wake-up call. We need systems that support families, not push them to the brink. So, here's my closing thought: what if this isn't just about one family in Wales? What if it's a symptom of a bigger problem? Personally, I think we need to start asking harder questions about how we prioritize the needs of families in policymaking. Because at the end of the day, when a parent has to choose between their job and their child's education, we've all failed. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. This is a conversation we should all be having.